all across America and around the world. This is Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio. And now, your host for today's program, Dale Throneberry.
Hey, good afternoon and welcome to Veterans Radio. My name is Dale Throneberry. I was a CW-2 helicopter pilot in Vietnam, 1969. I want to welcome you to our program. I've got a couple of really cool things going on today. Number one, we're hoping to talk with one of the members of the Mid-Michigan Honor Flight to talk about what they do and how they get people from here to there. It's kind of interesting. We're waiting for a phone call from the president of that. But I also have somebody who's gone on one of those flights. So if we can get him, we can take care of that if necessary. And then I've got a pretty good interview that I did yesterday or the day before with Rebecca Grant. Dr. Grant, of course, is our resident foreign affairs expert. We've had her on our program numerous times, starting back in 2008, 2009. And she's going to talk about what is going on in Ukraine, what's going on with China, what's going on with this new administration and some of the things that are happening and some of the things that might be upsetting to some of our listeners out there. So make sure that you stick around for that interview. We're hoping that I found it really interesting anyhow, and I think that you will too. And before we get into that, I got to thank our sponsors because we can't do the program without our sponsors. So I want to thank the following for their continuing support of Veterans Radio. You know, Veterans Radio is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So we don't really do commercials. We do more of the sponsorship portion. So the support. So Legal Help for Veterans, specializing in veterans disability claims. Call Legal Help for Veterans at 800-693-4800 or go to their website, legalhelpforveterans.com. The National Veterans Business Development Council, better known as NVBDC, is the nation's leading third-party authority for certification of veteran-owned businesses. For more information, go to their website, nvbdc.org, or give them a call at 888-237-8433. PuroClean, the paramedics of property damage. PuroClean is one of the nation's leading restoration franchise networks and is made up of entrepreneurs just like you. And veterans get 25% off the franchise fee. For more information, go to puroclean.com. It's the Charles S. Kettles VA Medical Center in Ann Arbor, Michigan. For more information, go to va.gov/Ann Arbor Healthcare. The Irwin Prescorn American Legion Post 46 and the Charles S. Kettles Vietnam Veterans of America Chapter 310, both of Ann Arbor, Michigan. If you'd like to support Veterans Radio, please go to our website, veteransradio.org, and click on the donate button. Thank you very much in advance, and we'll get right into our program here. We are going to be talking to Brian Graef. Brian Graef is a board member of the Veterans Radio America, and he's also gone on one of these Mid-Michigan honor flights. And so, Brian, tell me what they do.
Well, thank you, Dale. It was probably the thrill of my lifetime. A quick story. I was driving up north on US 23 and I saw a billboard sign, electronic billboard sign. It said Honor Flight. And I pulled over real quick and wrote down the number, went home that evening, called that number. Actually, I looked online to Google it online. And they do fly veterans to Washington, D.C. to see all the monuments. It was a 2-day affair. And I thought, well, that was very intriguing. So I filled out an application, emailed it in, and I thought, well, I'd never get a call. And I did get a call one day, and they said, we'd like to fly you to D.C. And I said, well, I can't make it. I'm down south at our property down south. And well, we'll put your application back in the pile. I'd figure I'd be back in the bottom of the pile or they would forget it. The following year, I got another call and I said, I'm going this time. And it was very exciting. There was 139 veterans on the flight going to DC. 76 of them were Vietnam veterans. And, of course, we didn't get that welcome home, so to speak, when we came back from Vietnam. They applaud us when we got off the plane in Washington, D.C. There was about 30 or 40 people at the airport there. I got to see all the monuments, went to the wall, which is very difficult for me. When we came back, flew back that evening, and I flew out of Battle Creek, Michigan. They gave us a large envelope. Man, somehow I knew what was going to be in that envelope. I did not open it when I was on the plane, and it was exactly what I thought it would be. It was a lot of letters to thank you for your service. It was all from family members and friends. And even when we got off the plane in Battle Creek, and they convoyed us over to a air museum in Battle Creek, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people in that museum just cheering for us, clapping for us, and thanking us for our service and welcome home. And that brought tears to my eyes.
Well, I can only imagine
In that envelope
Wow.
were, again, letters from family members. That was very exciting. I have two of them on my desk that I look at almost every other day, and one of them is from my nephew, who's an airborne ranger, and someday he may be able to go on one of those flights too. So I encourage people to put in an application, because you never know if you're going to be called, and it's something I would love to do it again one day. It was really exciting.
Yeah, well, you don't go by yourself on this. Is
No,
that
you do.
correct?
You have to have a sponsor, kind of a chaperone, so to speak. So I invited my son, who's been trying to get me to go back to Vietnam to get some closure. And I told him, I said, I've got closure. I don't need to go back. So close my eyes every night and I'm almost there. But my son went with me, and it was very exciting for him too. He really enjoyed it. We met two World War II veterans on that flight. There were 5 Korean veterans, but these two World War II veterans, one was 96 and the other one was 98.
Oh,
The gentleman that was 98 was a pediatric surgeon from U of M Hospital, and you would think he was in his 60s. Very exciting to talk to, very sharp, and great stories to tell. So we did hear a lot of stories, and it was just it was such a great feeling to be the camaraderie. We took our very large group picture in front of the Iwo Jima memorial.
oh,
There
sure.
was hundreds of us there, and it was pretty exciting.
I would think it would be a great trip. I know you told me I needed to put my name on the waiting list, so I didn't do it yet, but I will.
Yeah.
Uh, we've been talking with Brian Graef, who got to go on the one of those honor flights, and unfortunately, we're not able to connect with the people here locally for the Mid Michigan honor flight. And for more information, you can go to their website. It's actually midmichiganhonorflight.org. All their information is there. They have got a number of flights coming up. I think they've got 4 coming up this year. And you just put your name on the list on their website, and hopefully they'll call you and you get to take a sort of kind of, I like the way you put that, kind of a chaperone. It's nice. We're at this point in our life now where we have to have chaperones so we don't go wandering off
Well,
when we
that's
get,
true. That's true.
when
But
we
I
get to the,
encourage anybody from all branches of the service, no matter when did you serve, it's an exciting time.
I think it's a great opportunity. And there are still, it's hard to believe, but there are still many, many people that haven't had the opportunity to get to Washington to see all these monuments. And it, as you pointed out, it's a great opportunity for people to welcome us home. And, as you said, we didn't get the best welcome back in, 100 years ago. But yeah, I would encourage people to check that out. Thanks very much, Brian. Appreciate your time and telling this story. And maybe we can get the head honchos from the organization on the next time.
Sounds great. Thanks,
All right.
Dale.
Thanks, Brian. All right. We are going to take a real quick break, and then we're going to come straight back into our interview with Dr. Rebecca Grant. So stick around. I think you're going to really enjoy this interview. She's probably one of the smartest people I've ever met that can really explain what's going on in the world. So you're listening to Veterans Radio. I'll be back after she's done. So you're listening again to Veterans Radio. See you soon.
The Medal of Honor is the highest award for valor in combat given a member of the Armed Forces of the United States. There have been over 3,400 recipients of the nation's highest award. This is one of them. Sergeant First Class Stanley Adams led a 13-man charge against a North Korean force of 150. Details after this.
If you have a VA claim denied by the Board of Veterans' Appeals, contact Legal Help for Veterans at 1-800-693-4800. They're experts in handling cases before the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. Their number again, 1-800-693-4800.
Adams's platoon, holding an outpost some 200 yards ahead of his company, came under a determined attack by an estimated 250 enemy troops. Intense small arms, machine gun, and mortar fire from three sides pressed the platoon back against the main line of resistance. Observing approximately 150 hostile troops silhouetted against the skyline advancing against his platoon, Adams leaped to his feet, urged his men to fix bayonets, and with 13 members of his platoon charged the hostile force. Within 50 yards of the enemy, Adams was knocked to the ground when pierced in the leg by an enemy bullet. He jumped to his feet and, ignoring his wound, continued on to close with the enemy when he was knocked down 4 times from the concussion of grenades which had bounced off his body. Shouting orders, he charged the enemy positions and engaged them in hand-to-hand combat, where man after man fell before his terrific onslaught with bayonet and rifle butt. After nearly an hour of vicious action, Adams and his comrades routed the fanatical foe, killing over 50 and forcing the remainder to withdraw. Upon receiving orders that his battalion was moving back, he provided cover fire while his men withdrew. Adams so inspired his comrades that the enemy attack was completely thwarted, saving his battalion from possible disaster.
The Medal of Honor series is a production of Veterans Radio.
Military veterans touch everyone's life. I'm guessing right now you're thinking of a veteran, a close friend, relative. Maybe it's you. Even the toughest of us sometimes need help, but don't know where to turn for support. You don't need special training to help a veteran in your life. Even small actions can make a world of difference. If you know a veteran in crisis, please call the Veterans Crisis Line, 800-273-8255. 800-273-8255. A message from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs.
Welcome back to Veterans Radio. Our guest today is Dr. Rebecca Grant. She is one of the vice presidents at the Lexington Institute. She is a frequent contributor to Veterans Radio. In fact, she is our most trusted source of information for about what's going on in the world. So, Dr. Grant, welcome back.
I'm glad to join Veterans Radio again. What a pleasure.
Thank you very much. All right, well, let's get to the I don't know which elephant is in the room or not, but I suppose we should probably take a look at Ukraine right off the bat. There's a whole lot of information out there. Some of it I think is a little misleading. The meeting that Zelensky had with the president, was it just last week, where it got a little testy?
Yes, it's coming up now on 2 weeks ago since the most dramatic Oval Office meeting that we've ever seen. You know, we always knew that foreign leaders and our U.S. presidents would have arguments behind closed doors. But when Vladimir Zelensky met with President Trump and most of his cabinet in the White House, it was February 28th, Zelensky had come specifically to sign a deal about a joint venture for mining critical minerals in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And there was to be a press conference and a fancy lunch with flowers and herb chicken and whatnot. And it turned into a brawl, a hockey match, not a fist fight, but almost, with Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance really angry at Zelensky, and Zelensky holding his own in front of the cameras. And this was just the first time we've seen this play out in real time. You know, I have a PhD in international relations, and I've done a lot of historical archival work, and I'm telling you, sometimes they'll keep stuff classified just because For example, President Eisenhower in the 1950s said something mean about France's President Charles de Gaulle. 30 years of classification on that one, you know.
Right, yes.
So it was a shock to see it play out. You know, it took a very serious turn, and it has been repaired, but what had to happen in the end was that Zelensky did apologize for his conduct. And, you know, I felt he really owed it to the U.S., but also to NATO. Well, the NATO nations have supported Zelensky so strongly. And when NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte asked, you know, to get this knitted up, that was important. But meanwhile, the U.S. for a while paused military aid to Ukraine. And I'd love to spend just a moment on that, if that's okay with you.
No, that's fine. I think it's really important.
Because, you know, as your listeners know, it's not just sending the missiles or the Abrams tanks or the F-16s that they have. There's a constant process of aid, including things like software updates for the F-16s. When the F-16s went over last summer, the Air Force's 68th Electronic Warfare Squadron tuned them all up and made them special, secret, ready to deal with Russian electronic warfare. And, you know, that's a constant process of back and forth. The same is true with maintenance. Even on something like the HIMARS, there are continual maintenance updates that go on. And there's just this, you know, software is what you go to war with now. This is the modern battlefield, and you don't fight without constant tech refresh. So to pause U.S. assistance to Ukraine, even for a week, as it turned out, it's been turned back on now, was really quite dramatic. And then, of course, there's a lot of intelligence sharing. You know, they're pretty quiet about it, but NATO has included Ukraine in its cyber defenses, actually since the beginning of the war, and then formally over the last 2 years. We also do a lot of space system support to Ukraine. You know, if you know how you track Russian bombers and incoming missiles and drones, you know, that all works best when you have space queuing for those systems.
Right.
And then we know that from the very beginning, some of our U.S. companies like Microsoft and Amazon have supported Ukraine by literally pulling Ukrainian government operations up into the cloud before the Russians could hack them. So, you know, when the aid was turned off, that was a pretty strong signal. It has been renewed, and now we're looking at a series of peace negotiations.
Right. Yeah, I saw that they offered an agreement, and I guess evidently right now our good friend Putin is pushing back a little bit on that.
Well, here's another headache. I mean, what did we really think? So for 2 weeks, the attention focused on repairing the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, and that's been done. Now the issue is, will Putin negotiate at all? And, you know, I see a couple things going on here. One, there is a lot going on behind the scenes. I note that our CIA director, John Ratcliffe, has been talking to his counterpart in Russia. We've seen Trump's special envoy, Stephen Witkoff, who is a longtime friend of Donald Trump's back from their days doing real estate in New York. He has been off negotiating as well. There's just a multi-layered approach going on. So I hope there's something going on behind the scenes, because out in public, it's looking pretty tough. You know, Zelensky and the Ukrainian side have agreed to a temporary ceasefire. And this is supposed to be stop the shooting for, let's say, a period of 30 days, and then go to another phase that will be formal negotiations. And there's some pretty good things in that piece of the deal, that if a ceasefire happens, it would be obviously no shooting on the front, also no drone and missile attacks, mainly by Russia, but Ukraine did launch a small drone attack into Russia a couple days ago. And then here's the big one. Pause operations in the Black Sea. Now, Ukraine has been just wiping the floor with Russia's Navy in the Black Sea. You know, that's where Crimea juts out into that, and there used to be a big, important Russian naval base there at Sebastopol. But the Ukrainians have done such a great job with unmanned surface vehicles and ships that are, you know, kind of remotely piloted, some interesting coastal defenses. the U.S. and NATO have helped them a lot with that, but the result is the Russians really can't use the Black Sea for naval operations in the way they used to, and they've even moved their fleet headquarters out of Sebastopol and Crimea up to a safer spot. So this ceasefire would do some really good things for Ukraine. It would do some good things for Russia as well. Sadly, Putin has said, well, I don't think so. I'll propose my own ceasefire. And, of course, behind all of this is the number one thing that Putin has used to go to war, and that is the support of China.
Yep.
It is China that buys Russia's energy. We believe China also supplies some high-tech components that have helped Russia modernize its helicopters, tanks, etc. And Xi Jinping in China continues to give his friend Vladimir Putin full support for this war in Ukraine, this illegal invasion. And of course, under this alliance, they've gone so far as to include North Korean troops fighting in Russia around the Kursk region. So it is an incredibly complicating factor to have China saying to Putin, yeah, go on, we don't mind a bit.
My question, I guess, is I think it was Zelensky was saying, or somewhere I was reading, that Putin is not known for keeping his word. And I think that that's something that we have to really consider. It's just crazy when, when they were trying to promote the whole idea that Ukraine started this war. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts on are trusting Putin, or is he becoming sort of a mini puppet of the Chinese?
Well, that is exactly right, Dale. And economically, Russia is becoming a vassal state of China. But your point about negotiations is so well taken. This is Putin. Even if he agrees to something, we know that he's going to maneuver. And the past record is that he has broken ceasefires. This was part of what made things so hot in that Oval Office meeting. Zelensky, who ironically was elected in 2019, first time into politics, he was an entertainer.
Right.
He ran on the platform of getting peace. And there have been multiple ceasefires in Ukraine, not to go too far into the history. So Zelensky is there saying, I had an agreement with Germany and France and Russia to have a ceasefire, and Putin continued to break it. Mm-hmm. So that is a real question. And I hope that the last couple of weeks have really shown everybody what you just said, that this war was Putin's idea. There's fighting in Ukraine because Putin has a crazy, bizarre idea that he has to destroy some so-called Nazi regime in Ukraine and regain Russian dominance. This is just a crazy idea here in the 21st century, and that is the only reason that there is a war going on there. This is not because NATO exists. This is not for any other reason. This is not to do with any previous Ukrainian governments. It's really all in Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin's mind. Mm-hmm. And sadly, he has a taste for war. Right. And so this is where the negotiations are going to have to take place. There's going to have to be a leverage or pressure on Putin that will get him to implement a reasonable agreement and then keep it.
Right. And you hope that and I know this may not happen at all, but the idea that the Russian population themselves will say, they're getting tired of losing their men and women out there.
They are. Some interesting developments as Putin has started organizing veterans groups inside Russia. And by organizing, I really mean starting to formalize them so that there can't be groups of discontented veterans. The casualty lists, hard to get a clear number, but I think the best one I've seen says 172,000 Russians dead, about another 610,000 wounded. Putin pays a bounty to the families of the dead soldiers, maybe he does for the wounded as well. But you're looking at a situation where you've got nearly 1 million Russian casualties of one sort or another. And that's not including, the Russians that maybe aren't wounded, but are, it's a terrible war.
Right.
Coming back into Russian society, and how will they handle the families? This was enough when the Soviet Union fought in Afghanistan, and the casualties were, under 50,000. But it was enough to help bring down the old Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. How does Putin deal with the discontent over this truly pointless and brutal war? So we see him, he has, obviously complete control, clamps down on the media, anything that goes on in Russia, he controls, and he's obviously now seeking to get ahead of any veteran discontent and control those veteran groups in Russia. Kind of scary.
It's very scary. We're talking here with Dr. Rebecca Grant, our expert of what's really going on in the world. Some of our sources are not as trustworthy as they used to be, I think. So you mentioned, though, the idea of this whole thing not being against NATO. The current administration is, blustering and, threatening the idea of pulling out of NATO, which I know in my heart will not happen. But why do you think that I know he's trying to get everybody to pay their fair share. What do you think about that?
It is about getting NATO to do its part. And then I think if you look back, the NATO alliance, the first commander was General Dwight Eisenhower before he was president. He came back. He was the president of Columbia University in New York, and he agreed to leave that job and go back and take over NATO. And they gave him Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery as his deputy. And you World War II buffs will remember.
Those two guys, yes.
They didn't get along all that well. So, but the idea was that NATO would, I don't think anybody ever envisioned NATO lasting as long as it has. Now, that said, NATO is a very different alliance than it was during the Cold War. We got, 32 members at this point with Finland and Sweden. Sweden had not been in any alliance since the era of Napoleon, 200 years.
I thought that was really unusual.
Yeah, pretty amazing. They've been neutral. They have, strong defense, and heck, Sweden, back in the day, actually occupied Moscow, hundreds of years ago. But the threat of Russia under Putin is so serious that Sweden threw aside that tradition and joined NATO. So, NATO is a very strong defensive alliance. I do not for 1 second hold with this idea that NATO expansion provoked Putin. It's just an excuse. These are democracies that have willingly joined NATO, and they're very different, from Helsinki to Istanbul. Got some real different governments there. What is Trump's objective? He does want to see, if we're going to continue to go forward, NATO has already passed 75 years. We want to go forward with this. He does want to see the Europeans pay more. Several countries have agreed to do that. Top of the list is Poland, which is approaching spending 5% of GDP on defense, which is huge. Heck, we only spend a little under 3%. Great Britain has agreed to do more. So has Finland. So have many, many others. This is a long-standing quest from President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, President Trump. Again, they've all wanted NATO to increase defense spending. Part of this, of course, for the NATO nations is that they do buy a lot of U.S. equipment. They also want to make some of their own. And it's an issue of how to get that going. I don't see any, so I think Trump is going to be really hard on them. and at the same time, there's some pretty, if you look at the tariffs with Europe, there's some things that would really surprise you. Germany has super high tariffs on U.S. cars, and yet, obviously we see a lot of German cars in the United States. So there's some very uneven things, and he's kind of setting out to redo all that, and it's a big shock. We haven't seen this type of diplomacy on the security or the economic side at all. But the U.S. remains incredibly important to NATO, and I like to look at NATO's new operational concept, which is really about how to defend against Russia for the long term. Our European NATO partners are really scared, especially on the Eastern Front. You're talking the Baltic states,
right.
Poland, and so many others. That really is the new front line. Don't forget, we have 10,000 U.S. Army forces permanently stationed in Poland at this point. It's rotational, but the garrison's becoming permanent. And so I think that the commitment remains very strong on the military side. NATO's very interlaced. And, one thing we want to see out of Ukraine is an ability to continue to have NATO step up in defending all of Europe, because the Russian threat is not going away. There could be a ceasefire tomorrow, and we'd still have a problem with Russia's rearmament.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's just as you say, just a threat it's always there. And you think we're nervous about what's going on here locally. Imagine if you had, you bordered Russia, as you mentioned, like the Baltic states and, the Estonias and all that other thing. And, oh man, I'd be nervous all the time. Let's kind of move a little bit away from the Ukraine to what's going on a little bit more with China and how they're getting more involved in the world out there. You mentioned in a note to me about that they're having some naval exercises themselves in the Middle East.
Yes, I mean, what a surprise, right? They've actually done this for 5 years in a row, but earlier this week we had naval exercises between China, Russia, and Iran.
Oh, what a trio, yes.
What a happy trio.
Yes.
And they picked the most obvious public spot in the Middle East to run these exercises, and that is the Gulf of Oman. This is the body of water at the top of the Arabian Sea that goes into the Strait of Hormuz, which is that super, super tiny, narrow area that is so contested, right? The shipping traffic through there, it's incredible. It's like if you pick the most trendy, popular spot in your neighborhood with all the restaurants and shops, this is what the Gulf of Oman is like. So everybody was watching. We do, of course, have U.S. naval forces there. Our aircraft carrier, right now it's the Harry S. Truman that is there with Carrier Air Wing 1, accompanying destroyers, and there are also other NATO navies there, several of them, but you usually have someone from Britain, France, the South Koreans. You just don't know who might be there. So this was a relatively small exercise, a couple of Russian ships because, the Russian Navy, not what it once was. The Iranians were there. They did a great big night fire exercise because, naval gunfire looks prettiest at night.
Yes, it does. It's pretty impressive.
Pretty impressive. And then the Chinese sent a very interesting ship. They sent one destroyer and a supply ship with it. And so why is this relevant? Just 2 weeks ago, China had done a big naval exercise right by Australia. Boy, were the Australians mad. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Australia and China are big trading partners, but Australia, what a staunch ally.
Right.
So the China's Navy plans this out. The U.S. Navy plans its exercises months in advance. So does China's Navy. So this is part of a planned display of military power. And back to this exact Chinese Type 052D destroyer that turned up in the Gulf of Oman. This is a destroyer. It's only about 3 years old. China has built more than 30 of this Type 052D in the last 10 years. Huge increase in naval power. This one is called the Baotu, named after a city in China. And it's the stretch deck version. It's got about a 4 meter longer deck to accommodate helicopters. Mm-hmm. Lots of VLS, vertical launch system tubes, a pretty powerhouse destroyer. And just kind of a symbol, in a way, of the expansion of Chinese maritime power. And to have it down there operating in the Gulf of Oman, I mean, China is no match for the U.S. Navy and some of our allies in global force projection. But just the fact that now this is year 5 of a routine operation down there. They operated also in part out of a port in Pakistan, around Karachi. They've long invested in the port structure there. Oh. And then I'm going to put another layer on top of it and tell you there was a huge list of observers. It included members of a group called the BRICS, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China. This is an alternative group to the G7 run by China, trying to do a lot of currency reform. So they invited all the BRICS partners down to watch this big exercise. And it includes countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others in the region. And the big picture message here is China's trying to say, hey, you don't just have to be allies with the U.S. or the West. Here's a choice. China, we're becoming more dominant with our sea power. We're dominant with our economic power. And, we're a big power too. So that's the kind of big picture of what we're dealing with as we think about Ukraine and other situations. But, the truth is China is really trying to make inroads in the Middle East. And of course, this ties down a lot of our forces. We still have about 35,000 U.S. forces of all types deployed in the Central Command region. And China just loves to stir the pot over there.
I was just saying, while you were talking, I was just thinking about the prodding with a stick. Like, okay, we're going to stick it over here on you, and then, oh, by the way, in the Pacific, we're also going to be doing it over here. All these things just almost to not only divert our attention, but to just annoy us. I'm afraid when you were talking about all those ships in that Gulf there, somebody's going to run into somebody and something will happen and, bullets will start flying and rockets will start flying. And the next thing you know, we've got our little battle going on out there. Everything seems to be very tense around the world. I think maybe I'm just exaggerating that myself, but I am concerned about this is kind of a transition over about the reducing of the U.S. aid to all these various countries around the world, and I'm wondering what that message is that we're sending. And, is China just going to jump in and fill the void that we're leaving? Well,
perfect point, because, in looking just at USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, which dates back, I think, to the 1960s, I'm sure that we would all say that there was some, it's a government agency. Of course, there's some waste and some things that need to be relooked. And overall, I think, probably was about time for someone to come along and really shake up the U.S. federal government and see, does it have to be as big as it is? I think a lot of us agree, maybe not with the specifics every case, but with the principle. But USAID did certainly execute a mission, particularly in Africa. And okay, you can argue whether you think Africa is a vital interest or not, but a lot of what they did was work that would counter Chinese investments. So, sometimes just really specific, like the production of solar energy. Now, I think I have a lot of pros and cons personally about solar, but USAID would go and make investments in specific countries, kind of trying to get ahead of where China was investing. As we know, China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, has done a lot of investment in Africa and throughout what we used to call the Third World. Oftentimes these investments aren't such a great deal. They'll come in and build a road or a soccer stadium or, something to do with water or power. And then the country owes them a lot of debt. And it's not always such a great thing. But in this case, USAID did certainly part of its mission was very strategic. And I wouldn't want to see that get lost. I'm told another thing that has changed a little bit here is there's been a new directive to be careful not to get rid of the cybersecurity components within the various departments. And then back on countering China's influence, I really got to give Secretary of State Marco Rubio immense credit, because he scored an early victory really back in January in negotiating with Panama over the canal. And the big win there was that Panama said they would not renew their membership in China's Belt and Road program. So Rubio basically picked off Panama, which was fantastic. I'd like to see that happen in more cases, because China does use a very effective form of economic influence, economic warfare, it looks like to me, in order to gain a foothold around the world. They have a vast requirement for resources, whether that's all the fish from the coast off South America or oil that they import. And they're really after the resources, and then they are after world domination. They make that so clear. They just had one of their big political meetings and made it clear again. And because of that, at this point in time, we do see a higher pace of Chinese military activity and Chinese military threat.
It's a wonder any of us sleep at night. It's just anyway. All right, so let's kind of move on. In your note yesterday, you asked to ask about Trump's idea of a Golden Dome missile defense for the United States. Would you like to kind of talk to our audience about that?
Yes, this is a major project. So it started out as the idea of having an Iron Dome over the United States. And Iron Dome comes from one of Israel's missile defense systems. As we know from watching the conflict with Gaza and the attacks coming in from Gaza, from Hezbollah in the north, and sometimes even from the Houthis, Israel has an extremely effective missile defense shield. A lot of it is super short range because obviously the rockets coming up out of Gaza or incoming from southern Lebanon is very, very, very close. So part of their system is called Iron Dome. And President Trump liked it so much that he said, I want an Iron Dome for America. And the people in charge of this would be our U.S. Northern Command, which does all the defense, kind of dating back to the Cold War, with our defense with Canada in North American Air Defense Command, what used to be the control center at Cheyenne Mountain, all that. It's now Northern Command, and they had been saying for a couple of years at Northern Command that they would really like to do more with missile defense, drone defense. I mean, we have 1,000 drones a month coming across the southern border. Anyway, put all this together, and Trump gave Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth a 60-day tasking to put together a proposal for Iron Dome for the USA. About 2 weeks into it, they started calling it the Golden Dome. And to be clear, it's not exactly the same Iron Dome because while Israel faces short-range threats, the U.S. faces much longer-range threats coming from over the ocean. So what's going on now is we are right, I think about 57 days into the 60-day tasking, and various the Pentagon and industry partners have been scrambling to put together some proposals, basically sort of for a small, medium, and large version of how to do this defense. Again, it won't be exactly like a complete shield, but there are definite improvements that we can make to our missile defense system. What we have right now is interceptors on the West Coast, a few at Vandenberg in California, and the bulk of them up at Fort Greely in Alaska. They are designed really to intercept what we call the rogue threat. That would be you, North Korea, or anybody who's launching a small number of missiles. As far as Russia, for decades now, we've had kind of a mutually assured destruction. Okay, we're not going to nuke each other because we're deterred. So we don't really have a system there. But the threat from China has increased with maneuverable hypersonic missiles that can come in from unusual angles, not just coming down over the pole. And Russia has increased that threat as well. So this also connects directly to President Trump's passion for Greenland. It's if you grab a globe and look from the North Pole down to where you and I are, right? I'm in Washington, you're in the middle of the country. You'll notice that you see a lot of Greenland. Look at that. So we have a really important Space Force base at Pitufik. We used to be called Thule, it's now called Pitufik in Greenland. So the idea is, what can you put together that would improve missile intercept capability? It could have a couple of, we don't know the answer yet. We do know this is going to cost quite a bit of money to do this. Yes. But there will be some interesting features. One, the guts of this, if you will, is going to be space-based. We are changing from having about 75 super important military satellites. Now, I'm not talking about spy satellites run by the CIA or other people or whoever. I'm talking having about 75 military satellites that handle communications and infrared surveillance and some other things. That is going away from big satellites to a mesh architecture of smaller satellites that can be replaced more quickly and can be a self-reforming network in case they're attacked. So the space architecture piece that will detect missile launches or aircraft, Russian bombers, Chinese bombers, whatever, and track them to form the track for missile defense interception, that's going to be space-based. So that's a huge component, both the small satellites, so the launch, the satellite makers, and the networks. The other piece of this that's interesting is the interceptors. So we have already put a system on Guam. Guam is now defended for the first time, thank heavens, right? And they tested the system in December using a Standard Missile 3 with basically a kind of a Navy type of radar ashore. So what will we use for the interceptors? That's another possibility. And one thing that we may do is use some of our terrific U.S. Navy ships, destroyers primarily, that have a missile defense capability, which they all do now. And you can take some of these and assign them certain launch boxes around the coast in the case of a crisis, and they can contribute. So missile defense, it's always multi-layered. You want to have a good ability to intercept in the exo-atmosphere, that's up in cold space. The way we hit up there is it's not an explosion. You actually use a kinetic kill, so hit to kill, a rock hits a rock, and that blows the missile up. The incoming missile up enough. A couple things that we have to do to get this right. This all works on radio frequency spectrum. Our best military radars operate in part of the spectrum called S-band. We see some of our 5G wireless companies wanting to kind of get in there to expand our coverage so we can all have more videos. We got to make sure we really keep clear the spectrum bands that that military radars will use to contribute to Golden Dome improved missile defenses. So it's a very interesting concept. I think they will, at a minimum, come out with some good improvements. And, I'm just waiting to see, or maybe even in the next month or so, what some of the possibilities are for a U.S. Golden Dome.
I think that's very interesting. One last thing before I let you go today is I wanted to talk a little bit about those new Pentagon leaders out there. Seems like they're getting rid of a lot of military experience, especially military, the generals and everything else, bringing in businessmen. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, some pretty exciting good changes and some big surprises too. Our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, was relieved a few weeks ago. He's an airman, and I think you have to give C.Q. Brown a lot of credit for the way he deployed air forces and Navy forces to help defend Israel against attacks from Iran. That really was C.Q.'s handiwork. He commanded in the Middle East. At the same time, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, was relieved from her post. And we're waiting to see who will next take over the Navy. Admiral Kilby is the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, is currently performing that job. I'd love to see a naval aviator. It's been 25 years since an aviator had the top job in the Navy. And we have a new nominee for Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That will be Lieutenant General Dan Raisin, call sign Raisin Kane, who is an F-16 pilot from actually the Air National Guard. With combat experience and some entrepreneurial experience. And then, what I am seeing in this new crop of Pentagon civilian nominees is they all have one thing in common. They're all innovators. Whether that is businessmen like John Phelan, nominated for the Navy, or Steve Feinberg, who's nominated as Deputy Secretary of Defense. We're literally looking at people coming from running billions of dollars of venture capital funds to coming into the Pentagon. And you know what? Yeah, they need some briefings on certain systems, but these men, I think, bring an ability to make decisions quickly, and the Pentagon sure needs that. The Navy does. Our nominee for Secretary of the Air Force is a little bit different. He comes from the space world, where he has been a director at the National Reconnaissance Office. But remember, this is space. I mean, this is a man who has Elon Musk as a customer, right? Yeah. And is working on some extremely innovative use of small satellites, changing the way that we do networking. And so he as well, although he's a civilian and a technocrat, brings an innovator background. So I think this is the way that we're looking. The Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, similarly brings this experience. It looks to me like President Trump has primarily selected a group of innovators that can really shake up the way things get done in the Pentagon. And it could be very good. I mean, I think we need that ability to get the priorities straight and make some rapid decisions. This is coming at a time when Congress, despite all the back and forth, is very interested in increasing the defense budget to fix shipbuilding, bring some new aircraft programs in, and, of course, to carry out the Golden Dome if the Pentagon decides to go forward. So it's going to be a very interesting time with a totally new and different team running the Pentagon.
I think one of the questions, I guess, is that, I agree. Many of these things all need to be fixed and changed and modified and so forth. It's just, I think that many of us out here are just a little bit worried that, that they're coming in with, baseball bats instead of something a little bit more modified. And I think that's the thing that's got everybody concerned about what is happening currently in the administration and around the country, and why people get so upset about certain things. But I have to give this administration, I have to give them a chance to to implement some of the things. I mean, some of the ideas are really great. I just wish there'd be a little bit more finesse in promoting them to the American people. I think the American people right now, many of them, at least half of them, are just concerned. What do you think about that?
Oh, I understand. What's the old phrase? You can't make an omelet without breaking a lot of eggs.
Yeah.
But we are seeing a level of change and disruption that's very unfamiliar. And you know what? If it is effective, we will all say, okay, great, that worked out. But they have to be able to deliver the results. And that means the right budgets, program stability, having the right people in place. Like I said, the decision to go back and not fire some of the cybersecurity specialists in the departments was a good one. So I think there will be, there's a lot of blunt axe work going on. They will have to deliver the results. And it'll be a little while till we see that. I think they also need to remember that in the end, this is truly Congress's responsibility. Congress appropriates funds, and it will be Congress that has the say on the major programs. I do see the military working extremely hard to stay on top of executive orders and comply with those as they come along. And then, of course, this administration, at least on the defense side, has really fenced off some areas. They aren't going to tamper with the nuclear deterrence programs. They aren't going to tamper with shipbuilding. So I think as they learn their way, they may acquire a little bit more finesse. But wow, it is interesting times. I just want to make sure we see real results for the American people.
That's the goal, and that's what I really would like to see. And I would really like to have you back on in, say, 3 months or so to give us an update of what's happening and if they are meeting some of their goals. How do you think about that?
That sounds great. I tell you, ever since Secretary of Defense Hegseth started doing push-ups, I've done 5. So maybe in 3 months I'll be able to build up to a few more.
There you go. So anyway, we've been talking with Dr. Rebecca Grant. She's a vice president of the Lexington Foundation, or Lexington Institute, excuse me. And also she has her own IRIS research group that kind of looks at what's going on in the world from a military standpoint. We didn't even get into all the aircraft and stuff today, but we'll do that in a couple of months, all right?
Thank you, Dale.
Thank you very much for being. Okay, we're back here on Veterans Radio. That was Dr. Rebecca Grant, who's one of my favorite people to talk to about what's going on in the world of military aircraft and also foreign policy. I do have a couple of announcements today. I just wanted to get out a couple of fundraisers that are going on. Number one is Fisher House in Michigan is presenting Songs of Service this year. This is their big annual fundraiser. It's going to be Saturday, April 5th. And it's at the Book Tower in Detroit, Michigan. It begins at 4:30. The guest speaker is a good friend of Veterans Radio, and that is Doug Bradley. Doug is a Vietnam veteran and music historian, and he's going to be talking about what's what the music of Vietnam was all about. You can still get tickets are available, so you can go to Fisher House, Michigan, and pick up a ticket, and maybe we'll see you there. The other thing is that there is a where to go? Oh, recruiting. The DAV and recruitmilitary.com has a virtual recruiting program going on this Tuesday, the 18th, and you just need to go to recruitmilitary.com. It's on Tuesday from 11 till 3 Central Time. It's all online. 80 employers are looking for people. This is your opportunity, ladies and gentlemen. if you just got out of the military. So that's it for today. Rebecca Grant, our heroine here in this case. Until next week, this is Dale Throneberry. You are dismissed.
WAAM Ann Arbor. Our First Amendment at work. Real public radio. Unbiased, open, and honest discussion. 24 hours a day. Wham Radio. Wham. Talk 1600.
News this hour from townhall.com. I'm Jason Walker. Officials now say